Pindar was an ancient Greek lyric poet from Thebes. Of the canonical 9 lyric poets of ancient Greece, his work is the best preserved. Quintilian wrote, "Of the 9 lyric poets, Pindar is by far the greatest, in virtue of his inspired magnificence, the beauty of his thoughts and figures, the rich exuberance of his language and matter, and his rolling flood of eloquence, characteristics which, as Horace rightly held, make him inimitable. His poems, however, can also seem difficult and even peculiar." The Athenian comic playwright Eupolis once remarked that they are already reduced to silence by the disinclination of the multitude for elegant learning. Some scholars in the modern age also found his poetry perplexing, at least until the 1896 discovery of some poems by his rival Bacchylides. Comparisons of their work showed that many of Pindar's idiosyncrasies are typical of archaic genres rather than of only the poet himself. His poetry, while admired by critics, still challenges the casual reader, and his work is largely unread among the general public. Pindar was the first Greek poet to reflect on the nature of poetry and on the poet's role. Like other poets of the archaic age, he has a profound sense of the vicissitudes of life. But he also articulates a passionate faith in what men can achieve by the grace of the gods, most famously expressed in the conclusion to one of his victory odes. Creatures for a day. What is a man? What is he not? A dream of a shadow is our mortal being. But when there comes to men a gleam of splendor given of heaven, then rests on 'em a light of glory, and blessed are their days. His poetry illustrates the beliefs and values of archaic Greece at the dawn of the classical period. Works. Pindar's strongly individual genius is apparent in all his extant compositions, but, unlike Simonides and Stesichorus for example, he created no new lyrical genres. He was however innovative in his use of the genres he inherited. For example, in one of his victory odes, he announces his invention of a new type of musical accompaniment, combining lyre, flute and human voice. Although he probably spoke Boeotian Greek, he composed in a literary language that tended to rely more on the Doric dialect than his rival, Bacchylides, but less insistently than Alcman. There is an admixture of other dialects, especially Aeolic and epic forms, and an occasional use of some Boeotian words. He composed choral songs, yet it is by no means certain that they were all sung by choirs. The use of choirs is testified only by the generally unreliable scholiasts. Scholars at the Library of Alexandria collected his compositions in 17 books organized according to genre: 1 book of hymnoi, hymns; 1 book of paeans, paeans; 2 books of dithyramboi, dithyrambs; 2 books of prosodia, processionals; 3 books of parthenia, songs for maidens; 2 books of hyporchmata, songs for light dances; 1 book of encomia, songs of praise; 1 book of threnoi, laments; 4 books of eponychia, victory odes. Of this vast and varied corpus, only the eponychia, odes written to commemorate athletic victories, survive in complete form. The rest survive only by quotations in other ancient authors or from papyrus scraps unearthed in Egypt. Even in fragmentary form, however, they reveal the same complexity of thought and language that are found in the victory odes. Dionysius of Halicarnassus singled out Pindar's work as an outstanding example of austere style, but he noted its absence in the maiden songs or parthenia. One surviving fragment of a maiden song does seem to be different in tone, due however to the fact that it is spoken in the character of a girl. Enough of his dithyrambic poetry survives for comparison with that of Bacchylides, who used it for narrative. Pindar's dithyrambs are an exuberant display of religious feeling, capturing the wild spirit of Dionysus and pointing forward to the ecstatic songs of Euripides' Baccha. In one of these, dedicated to the Athenians and written to be sung in spring, he depicts the divine energy of the revitalized world. The establishment of these athletic and musical festivals was among the greatest achievements of the Greek aristocracies. Even in the 5th century, when there was an increased tendency towards professionalism, they were predominantly aristocratic assemblies, reflecting the expense and leisure needed to attend such events either as a competitor or spectator. Attendance was an opportunity for display and self-promotion, and the prestige of victory, requiring commitment in time or wealth, went far beyond anything that accrues to athletic victories today, even in spite of the modern preoccupation with sport. Pindar's odes capture something of the prestige and the aristocratic grandeur of the moment of victory, as in this stanza from one of his Isthmian odes, here translated by Geoffrey S. Conway. If ever a man strives with all his soul's endeavor, sparing himself neither expense nor labor to attain true excellence, then must we give to those who have achieved the goal a proud tribute of lordly praise, and shun all thoughts of envious jealousy. To a poet's mind the gift is slight, to speak a kind word for unnumbered toils, and build for all to share a monument of beauty. His victory odes are grouped into 4 books named after the Olympian, Pythian, Isthmian, and Nemean games, Pan-Hellenic festivals held respectively at Olympia, Delphi, Corinth and Nemi. This reflects the fact that most of the odes were composed in honor of boys, youths, and men who had recently enjoyed victories in athletic contests at those festivals. In a few odes, however, much older victories, and even victories in lesser games, are celebrated, often as a pretext for addressing other issues or achievements. For example, Pythian 3, composed in honor of Hieron of Syracuse, briefly mentions a victory he had once enjoyed at the Pythian Games, but it is actually intended to console him for his chronic illness. Nemean 9 and Nemean 10 celebrate victories in games at Sicyon and Argos, and Nemean 11 celebrates a victory in a municipal election on Tenedos. These 3 odes are the final odes in the Nemean Book of Odes, and there is a reason for their inclusion. In the original manuscripts, the 4 books of odes were arranged in the order of importance assigned to the festivals, with the Nemean festival, considered least important, coming last. Victory odes that lacked a Pan-Hellenic subject were then bundled together at the end of the Book of Nemean Odes. Style. Pindar's poetic style is very distinctive, even when the peculiarities of the genre are set aside. The odes typically feature a grand and arresting opening, often with an architectural metaphor or a resounding invocation to a place or goddess. He makes rich use of decorative language and florid compound adjectives. Sentences are compressed to the point of obscurity, unusual words and periphrases give the language an esoteric quality, and transitions in meaning often seem erratic. The images seem to burst out. It is a style that sometimes baffles but also makes his poetry vivid and unforgettable. Pindar's power does not lie in the pedigrees of athletes. It lies in a splendor of phrase and imagery that suggests the gold and purple of a sunset sky. F.L. Lucas. He has that force of imagination which can bring clear-cut and dramatic figures of gods and heroes into vivid relief. He has that peculiar and inimitable splendor of style which, though sometimes aided by magnificent novelties of diction, is not dependent on them, but can work magical effects with simple words. He has also, at frequent moments, a marvelous swiftness, alike in the succession of images, and in the transitions from thought to thought, and his tone is that of a prophet who can speak with the voices of Delphi. Richard Claverhouse. His odes were animated by one burning glow which darted out a shower of brilliant images, leapt in a wide hot spark across gaps unbridgeable by thought, passed through a commonplace leaving it luminous and transparent, melted a group of heterogeneous ideas into a short-lived unity and, as suddenly as a flame, died. Gilbert Hyatt's. Some of these qualities can be found, for example, in this stanza from Pythian 2. Composed in honor of Hieron. The stanza begins with this celebration of divine power, and then abruptly shifts to a darker, more elusive train of thought, featuring condemnation of a renowned poet, Archilochus, grown fat on the harsh words of hate. Archilochus was an iambic poet, working within a genre that licensed abusive and scurrilous verse, a regrettable tendency from the viewpoint of Pindar, whose own persona is intensely earnest, preaching to Hieron the need for moderation and submission to the divine will. The reference to the embittered poet appears to be Pindar's meditative response to some intrigues at Hieron's court, possibly by his rivals, condemned elsewhere as a pair of ravens. The intensity of the stanza suggests that it is the culmination and climax of the poem. In fact, the stanza occupies the middle of Pythian 2 and the intensity is sustained throughout the poem from beginning to end. It is the sustained intensity of his poetry that Quintilian refers to above as a rolling flood of eloquence, and Horace below refers to as the uncontrollable momentum of a river that has burst its banks. Longinus likens him to a vast fire, and Athenaeus refers to him as the great voice Pindar. Pindar's treatment of myth is another unique aspect of his style, often involving variations on the traditional stories. Since his original audience was familiar with the myths, and this allowed him to concentrate on unique and surprising effects. Reversing the chronological order was one such effect, as in Olympian 7 dedicated to Diagoras of Rhodes. But this could also resemble a circular pattern, beginning with a culminating event, followed by scenes leading up to it, and ending with its restatement, as in his account of the Dioscuri in Nemine 10. Myths enabled him to develop the themes and lessons that preoccupy him, in particular mankind's exalted relation with the gods via heroic ancestors, and, in contrast, the limitations and uncertainties of human existence. But sometimes the traditional stories were an embarrassment and were carefully edited, as for example, "Be still my tongue, here profits not, to tell the whole truth with clear face unveiled, away, away this story, let no such tale fall from my lips. For to insult the gods is a fool's wisdom, senseless, I hold it, for a man to say, the gods eat mortal flesh. I spurn the thought." His mythical accounts are edited for dramatic and graphic effects, usually unfolding through a few grand gestures against a background of large, often symbolic elements such as sea, sky, darkness, fire or mountain. Structure: Pindar's odes typically begin with an invocation to a god or the muses, followed by praise of the victor and often of his family, ancestors and hometown. Then follows a narrated myth, usually occupying the central and longest section of the poem, which exemplify a moral, while aligning the poet and his audience with the world of gods and heroes. The ode usually ends in more eulogies, for example of trainers, and of relatives who have won past events, as well as with prayers or expressions of hope for future success. The event where the victory was gained is never described in detail, but there is often some mention of the hard work needed to bring the victory about. A lot of modern criticism tries to find hidden structure or some unifying principle within the odes. 19th century criticism favored gnomic unity, i.e., that each ode is bound together by the kind of moralizing or philosophic vision typical of archaic gnomic poetry. Later critics sought unity in the way certain words or images are repeated and developed within a particular ode. For others, the odes are just celebrations of men and the communities, in which the elements such as myths, piety, and ethics are stock themes that the poet introduces without much real thought. Some conclude that the requirement for unity is too modern to have informed Pindar's ancient approach to a traditional craft. The great majority of the odes are triadic in structure, i.e., stanzas are grouped together in threes as a lyrical unit. Each triad comprises two stanzas identical in length and meter and a third stanza, differing in length and meter, but rounding off the lyrical movement in some way. The shortest odes comprise a single triad, the largest comprises 13 triads. 7 of the odes, however, are monostrophic. The monostrophic odes seem to have been composed for victory marches or processions, whereas the triadic odes appear suited to choral dances. Pindar's metrical rhythms are nothing like the simple, repetitive rhythms familiar to readers of English verse. Typically, the rhythm of any given line recurs infrequently. This adds to the aura of complexity that surrounds Pindar's work. In terms of meter, the odes fall roughly into two categories. About half are in dactylo-epitrites and the other half are in aeolic meters based on iambs and choriambs. Chronological order. Modern editors have assigned dates, securely or tentatively, to Pindar's victory odes, based on ancient sources and other grounds. The date of an athletic victory is not always the date of composition but often serves merely as a terminus post-quem. Many dates are based on comments by ancient sources who had access to published lists of victors, such as the Olympic list compiled by Hippias of Elis, and lists of Pythian victors made by Aristotle and Callisthenes. There were, however, no such lists for the Isthmian and Nemean games. Pausanias complained that the Corinthians and Argives never kept proper records. The resulting uncertainty is reflected in the chronology below, with question marks clustered around Nemean and Isthmian entries. And yet it still represents a fairly clear general timeline of Pindar's career as an epinician poet. The code M denotes monostrophic odes and the rest are triadic. Manuscripts, shreds and quotes. Pindar's verses have come down to us in a variety of ways. Some are only preserved as fragments via quotes by ancient sources and papyri unearthed by archaeologists, as at Oxyrhynchus. In fact, the extant works of most of the other canonic lyric poets have survived only in this tattered form. Pindar's extant verses are unique in that the bulk of them, the victory odes, have been preserved in a manuscript tradition, i.e., generations of scribes copying from earlier copies, possibly originating in a single archetypal copy and sometimes graphically demonstrated by modern scholars in the form of a stemma codicum, resembling a family tree. Pindar's victory odes are preserved in just 2 manuscripts, but incomplete collections are located in many others, and all date from the medieval period. Some scholars have traced a stemma through these manuscripts, for example Ulrich von Weilemer-Wutzmollendorf, who inferred from them the existence of a common source or archetype dated no earlier than the 2nd century AD, while others, such as C.M. Bauer, have argued that there are too many discrepancies between manuscripts to identify a specific lineage, even while accepting the existence of an archetype. Otto Schroeder identified 2 families of manuscripts but, following on the work of Polish-born classicist Alexander Turin, Bauer rejected this also. Different scholars interpret the extant manuscripts differently. Bauer, for example, singled out 7 manuscripts as his primary sources, all featuring errors or gaps due to loss of folios and careless copying, and one arguably characterized by the dubious interpolations of Byzantine scholars. These he cross-referenced and then supplemented or verified by reference to other, still more doubtful manuscripts, and some papyral fragments, a combination of sources on which he based his own edition of the odes and fragments. His general method of selection he defined as follows: where all the codices agree, there perhaps the true reading shines out. Where, however, they differ, the preferred reading is that which best fits the sense, meter, scholia and grammatic conventions. Wherever, moreover, 2 or more readings of equal weight are found in the codices, I have chosen that which smacks most of Pindar.